Welcome. For the past 2 weeks, we've been looking at studying the Apostle Paul's words addressing Christians by way of household code. And he gave us 3 pairs of household code. First, he talked about 2 weeks ago, we looked at how he addressed husband and wives. And then last week, we looked at parents and children relationship. And today, he talks about masters and bond servants. So there's 3 pairs of this household code that are quite common even in those days, in Roman time. So now the relevance for us, perhaps you may think, well, husband and wife, that makes sense, that's relevant. Parents and children, that's relevant. But how about today, masters and bond servant? You know, how's that going to relate to me or for us today? It may not seem obvious right now, but it will be, hopefully, by the end of today, that he is speaking to you and me. Now, because, let me just quickly say this, the words that we translate, if you use ESV version, like I do, and most of us in this church, you would have that word as bond servants, translated into English as bond servants, the Greek word doulos, as bond servants. Now, some of your translation, if you have other translation, it may say slaves. How can slaves and masters relate to us today, right? But the thing is this, the word doulos, it's in this context are more appropriately translated as bond servants as in ESV. So in today's term, Paul is addressing all of us who are working. So if you work, this is us. This is you in this page. Workers and bosses. So when you read masters and bond servants, think about masters or workers and the boss. Okay? So think in that way, and then you'll be on the right path to understanding the message. So as I said before, we're coming to the end now of Ephesians. We've been on this book for 3 months at least now. There's one more sermon to go next week. Amazing passage, which we'll have another speaker who will be preaching to you next week, a much better person than me. So come next week to hear the end. You know, after all 3 months, you don't want to miss the end, right? So come for the end next week. And then after that, just by way of map, we're going to continue on our series on John. So we're going to finish up on John and the crucifixion of Christ leading up to Easter. That will be a wonderful series on John. And then we're going to embark on a really long, amazing series on the book of Exodus. And I'm going to tie in with kids' ministry as well. So they will be learning about Exodus as we learn about Exodus as well. So today, our passage is pretty straightforward. If you're a Christian, then this will affect how you work, basically. How you go to work, how you live your life at work. So first he addressed bond servants, and then he addressed masters. Okay? Straightforward, that's our outline. Bond servants first, masters second. Workers first, bosses, managers later. If you are managers, you are both, right? So you're both bond servants, you are workers, as well as you are masters in that way. So, but now, bond servants. So this, perhaps those of you who do not have anyone under you, you are the newbie at workplace. You're the lowest it could get, right? You can't get any lower. Any lower will be on the ground, right? So it says this, if you're workers, if you're bond servants, obey, verse 5 to 8, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ. Not by way of eye service or people pleasers, but as bond servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord, not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Now, I have to address this because some of us think like you may come from a background that don't understand the scripture or have heard people in your workplace that accuse Christianity of supporting slavery. And it seems on the face value, when you read this, Paul and the Bible are encouraging or at least not condemning slavery or supporting in a way. But the word doulos here, as I said before, has been accurately translated by ESV in our context as bond servants rather than as slaves. Now, not just me, especially if we come from a mindset of slavery in the 17th, 18th century American slavery history. It's nothing like that. It's nothing like that. These are people that Paul addressing in church. You see? So, any serious students, if you're students of the Bible or any historical, real, not one of those social media historian that seems to know everything, right? In the social media age, everyone seems to be the expert of everything. During COVID, everyone's the expert in the infectious disease. Everyone is the expert. They know everything. They never study about, vaccine or anything. Suddenly they become the expert. And the war comes along, Ukraine and Russia war, suddenly they become a social politician expert. They just war expert suddenly, overnight. But same with your friends that try to understand the scripture. They're expert in this as well. They might not read the Bible, might not have read the Bible, but they know what the Bible is about somehow. So any serious students of the Bible, any historians would have to agree that this word doulos here has nothing to do with the slavery that we would understand as modern day slavery. Okay? In our context, even we could stretch it out to the point that we could translate as servants simply, or workers. So from here onwards, think of it when you read bond servants, read it as workers, like you and I. If you work, this is you. Okay? Now remember the context of Paul here speaking to church context, to people who come to church, family, husband and wife, parents and children. Now he said boss and people working for you. He addressed them equally. There's no kind of, addressing the boss. When you get home, tell your slaves. No, the slaves are there with them. He addressed them equally. Okay? So what is bond servant? Why is it not servants? Think of it as a contract workers. So bond servants have a set period of contract that they're contracted to work with their masters. Commonly 6 years in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, they said slaves can only work for you, be slaves for you for 6 years, and then you must free them after 7 years. So there's a contract period where they, during which they get paid. They have shelter. They get food, right? Now, and then they can leave at the end of the contract. When the contract ends, they can leave. So this is not a lifetime of slavery that we understand. Think of it as a contract work. The question is, why would people get themselves into contract like this? Yes, it is still not as nice as becoming the boss or the masters, as you pretty much have to obey in a way, have to commit to that contract period. Why do people do that? Well, in those days, when unemployment rate is so high, this is job security. Instead of having go to the market, to the gate of the town and waiting for someone to employ you for the day, you got a secure job for the next 7 years or 10 years or whatever that contract period is. So it's a job security for them. So now let's look at what Paul says to bond servants, to workers, to you and I who work. He says this in verse 5, bond servants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ. Now, have you noticed a pattern as we go through this series, especially the last 2 weeks? Let me just highlight this. As Paul addresses this household code, first to husband and wife, he says in chapter 5:22, he says, husband and wife, wives, submit to your husband. How? As to the Lord. And then he says, husband, love your wives. How? As Christ loved. And then last week we hear, children, obey your parents in the Lord. Fathers, discipline and instruct your children in the Lord. Now again he says similarly, bondservant or workers, obey your boss with a sincere heart as you would Christ. What's the pattern there? The pattern is clear. we do this as we would serve Christ, as we would love Jesus. See, now the interesting thing about this is this, because Paul doesn't say, obey if your boss is fair and good. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, obey if your boss is a Christian. Or obey, work hard if you like your job. Or if your pay is good. You say, I'm just going to give the minimum effort because, I get paid minimum wage. So who cares? God cares, because this command, this instruction from Paul, it says, do that as you would to Jesus, to your Lord, right? So there's no conditions of this obedience except one, that is, as you would to Jesus. And I think that is the condition of all condition. What does it mean then for us? What does it mean really when it says, obey your masters with sincere heart as you would to Jesus? What does it mean? Well, it means this. It means Christians should be the best workers there is. If Christian lived out in this way, then Christian is the best workers around. Because you'll be the most honest workers in the office. You'll be the most hardworking guy in the office. And you'll be the kindest person as well. Most sincere. And think of all the good things that Christ teaches us. Think about the heart of Jesus, and that's how you would be at work. Who wouldn't want to employ someone like that? Right? That's what it means to obey as Christ would, as you would to Christ, that you be the best employees there is. And the second thing it means this, that it means your work is how you would display God's glory. Because you don't work for you don't work for anyone, you work for God. So as you work, you would display the glory of God. And that's how important it is. That's how magnificent it is. Regardless of what you do. See, from the Garden of Eden, from the very beginning, Adam and Eve, God appointed them to work, and their work is the way of them displaying the glory of God. In other words, is this: as Adam and Eve cultivate the garden, work the garden, they are worshiping God. Have you think about it that way as you work, whatever that you do? I don't know what you do, each and every one of you do. I know some of you what you do, but not everyone. But regardless, whatever you do, think of it. Have you think of it as a worship to God? When you get up in the morning, when you don't feel like going to work, you feel like, this is how I worship God, through my work. See, today, when people at your workplace see Christian ethics at work in you, what do they see? They'll see a glimpse of the glory of God. If just many more Christians work in this way, there'll be more people in the workplace that will come to faith, to Jesus, because they see the glory of God in you and through you. What I'm trying to say is this: every good and honest work, regardless of what you do, can be God glorifying. Regardless how low it is, how insignificant it is that you do. You may be a data entry person that no one knows. You may be someone who cleans the office. You may be someone who drives people around. You may be someone who brings people's coffee in the office. It does not matter. Every good work, every good and honest work is God glorifying, and it's a service to God Himself. It says this in verse 6 and 7, not by way of eye service. When you do this, don't do it by way of eye service. So when your boss looks, you look busy. When no one's looking, you do whatever you want to do, right? You say, not as people pleasers. You don't do it to please people. You do it because you know your boss is God Himself. But as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to men. That is radical. Now that is radical thinking. See, when Christian work, when you go to work, your work ethics do not depend on where you work and who's around. Your work ethics does not depend on that. Your work ethics, as we have seen, comes from who you are, your identity in Christ Jesus. How you work, how hard you work does not depend on your boss, does not depend on your pay. You can get paid double tomorrow, you just work as hard. You get paid half, you just work as hard and as honest. In practice, this is what it means. You don't call in sick when you're not sick. As simple as that. Christians, you don't call in sick when you're not sick. I know that's a common thing, even in workplace where Poppy used to work. Poppy doesn't get sick. In the house, she doesn't get sick. He's the one that doesn't get sick. My wife, Poppy, doesn't get sick. So every year, the manager, the boss would say, you got full sick leave. Just take them. But Poppy said, I'm not sick. See, but then again, I work in a workplace where I've known people to take sick leave regularly, like about the same day every month, just to use them up. So when you read Paul's word, it simply means this. Work as hard as you could, because even when no one is looking, God is looking. Another thing, this is what I mean. Christians do not stab people in the back just to get that promotion. Now, of course, that picture of stabbing people in the back, you said, no, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. But what would you do? Stab in the back here could simply mean talk yourself up and put people down to someone that matters in the office. You would spread that kind of seed to the people who can promote you about how good you are and how not so good the other person, your competitors, are. That's how you stab people in the back. So don't have a picture of getting a knife and literally, stab someone in the back. Christians don't even gossip about other colleagues. You just don't. You step away. If you can't stop it, you step away. Let alone joining in and adding more fuel to the fire. When people talk about someone else in the office, oh yeah, let me tell you what I heard last time. You don't do that. You step away. If you can stop it, you stop it. You say, this is no good. We don't do this. If you can't do it, if you're in a position where you can't do that, you would step away. Now, I know some of you hearing this and say, I'm not like that. I'm a good worker. I'm an honest worker. But as I said before, what Paul says is quite radical, to the point that not just how you do your work, but what motivates your work. He goes down so deep that he look at your heart. He said, serve the Lord. As you work, serve the Lord. This is the worship to God. So what it means is this. It's not just what's on the surface, but what's underneath as you work. What motivates you as you go to work? Ask yourself, why do you go to work every day? What drives you? Paul says that matter just as much as how you treat your colleague, how you treat your work. Do you work to get rich? Do you work so that you can retire early? Do you work so that you can have a comfortable lifestyle? Do you work so that you feel powerful over those who has less than you? Do you work so that you can control your life and other people's life? Or, many Asians around here, do you work to please your parents? See, some of you are even, perhaps borderline, if not already, addicted to your work. How do you know if you're addicted to your work? You know this if you cannot stop. You need to be on all the time. When was the last time you switched off your phone? Say like, this time, I'm off limit. No one can reach me. It's me, my God, or perhaps my spouse. If you're married, you know, your spouse has to have access. Otherwise, you especially if you're a guy, then you're doomed, right? If you're not reachable. When was the last time you say, there's this, that's it. Like regardless, there's time for me to not do work. See, you know you're addicted if your work is your life. When you introduce yourself to other people, a new person that you meet, and they ask you, hey, my name is so-and-so, and they ask, when you want to share who you are, how soon what you do comes up to the surface. How quickly that comes out. See, if your work is your identity, perhaps you are close to being addicted to your work. Because who you are simply means what you do. Your work defines who you are. So think about the next time you introduce yourself to someone else new. How quickly what you do comes to the surface. I'm just as guilty as charged as a pastor, because pastor is what I do. That could just come out on the surface as quickly as whatever you do. First and foremost, I'm a child of God. Being a pastor is what I do. See, the truth is, if you work hard for anyone else in this world, but for Jesus, you will destroy your life. In your work, right? If you work for anyone else except for Jesus, as how Paul would want us to be, you will destroy your life and your family. You will. Trust me. Especially if hardworking one. See, if you use your work to show your worth, like I'm all that, I'm amazing because of what I do or what I've achieved, then you will never ever be satisfied with what you do. Because what satisfies you now, in a few months, or in a year or two, will no longer satisfy you. For people who just come into work, starting salary, what's starting salary now? I don't know. Let's say starting salary is $60K, right? You say, before you got a job, you say, any job will do. I've served young people for many years, fresh graduate, and when I asked them, they asked me about job and how to find job. When I asked them, what kind of work do you want to do? They said, anything. Why? Because any salary is good than no salary. Guess what? After they got their first job, whatever it is, $60K, a year later, it's no longer happy with that. No longer satisfied. So what you earn does not satisfy you forever. Will not satisfy you forever. Will not ever, regardless how much you earn. The richest man in the world in America once asked by a reporter, so how much is enough? Like he owns like a lot of money and like one of the richest. He said, how much is enough? He said, just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. So if you use your work to gain your worth, you will never be satisfied, ever. You will want more. Not only that, you will want to be perfect in what you do because you want to impress people. You have high standard. You want to be perfect in everything. You want to do it right at all costs. That could be your health costs, your children, your family, even your faith in God. There's just too many people who slowly drifting away from their faith, and the reason is I'm too busy. Too busy for what? God, the Creator who give you breath every day. The fact that we can wake up in the morning and not dead and sleeping, and die in our sleep. That God that gives you that, you say I'm too busy for Him. You want to be perfect. Now, there's a quote by Brene Brown. She's a research professor at University of Houston. Brene specialized in human emotions and experience. She writes this in her latest book. Perfectionism is self-destructive. and addictive belief system that fuels this primary thought. If I look perfect, live perfectly, work perfectly, and do everything perfectly, I can avoid and minimize the painful feelings of shame, judgment, and blame. Research shows that perfectionism hampers success. In fact, it often sets you on the path to depression, anxiety, addiction, and life paralysis. See, to work well is to work for God. If you want to work well, there's no other way but to work for God. Now, I'm not talking about quitting your job and work in church like me as a pastor of a social work. It does not mean that. Paul's addressing people like you, doing whatever you do. To work well, to do is to work for God. And to see your work, whatever that you do, as God's calling in your life. And to be His image bearer in your workplace in order to display God's glory. Now that's a high calling. If you're an accountant, if you're a chef, if you're a teacher, whatever that you do, if you're a receptionist, you're a cleaner, ask yourself, am I displaying God's glory? Am I displaying the beauty of God in what I do? And Paul says you can, and you should. Because that's the goal of work. It's not to earn a living. Do you think that you can pay the bill because you work? You can pay the bill because God blesses you with work that pays you. It only takes a second for God to take your health and you can't wake up and can't walk and can't do your work. The fact that we can do what we do, it's God's blessing in our life. And God says, in your work, use it to glorify me. Your work is your worship to me. See, when you see your work as God's calling, then you can see that all your life is a worship to God. You don't say, I worship God on Sunday. All your life is a worship to God. Now, some of us stretch this truth to an extent that, well, I worship God every day, so I don't have to go to church. I don't have to have a community with believers. That's just as wrong, and it's extreme in the wrong way. Now, that's how Paul addressed bondservants, masters, and bondservants. Now he addressed masters. Masters, verse 9, do the same to them, to the workers, and stop your threatening, knowing that He who is both their masters and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with Him. Now, if you're business owners, a worker who has people working under you, this is you. This message is for you as masters. So if you have people working under you, you manage a team, this is for you. See, Christian bosses and managers, you should treat your workers like how you want to treat yourself, like how you treat yourselves. So I believe Christian bosses, before they give themselves a bonus, they would have given their people bonus first. That's what Christian bosses should do. If they're extra profit by the end of the year, when they look at the money, they don't think about themselves first. They think about the hardworking people that work for him first. And they give them bonus first. And if there's any leftover, they give themselves bonus. So treat your workers like how you would want to treat yourself. The message is clear. Why? Paul gives us an answer. He says, your master and their master, to managers, your master and their masters, your workers' masters, is the same person. God Himself. He said, you may think that you are their boss, but Paul says, God is their boss. Just as God is your boss, God is their boss. See, the simplest litmus test is this for you, managers, business owners, to see if you pass this test or not, is ask yourself this: will I work for me? Will I work for me? The way you carry yourself as a manager, as a boss, would you work for yourself? I'm not talking about self-employed, no. I'm talking about, would you want to have a boss like yourself? For many people, perhaps no. Perhaps no. So a few principles, practical principles for bosses and managers. Don't look down on your workers. Never ever look down on your workers, regardless of how low they are, because they are God's children just like you are. When was the last time you took notice? When you go to the mall and somebody cleaning the toilet as you go, when was the last time you acknowledged them? Or as you go to food court, those cleaning your table. Think about the lowest possible job there is in our city. When was the last time you acknowledged them like equal? Don't look down on your workers. Don't look down on anyone based on what they do. Because regardless of what you do, their master is Jesus, is God himself. Now, in your work, regardless whether you are a low position workers or a high position business owners or CEOs, always do it with excellence. Always do it good, well, hardworking, excellence. However, you don't do it for money. It's not about the pay. Because if it is about the pay, then your performance will depend on how much you get paid. And depends how good your boss is and how good the workplace is. So never ever work for money. Because if you work for money, this is what happens. You will use people and serve money. Your colleagues, your boss even, people under you, when you see people, you don't see equal. You see people, resources that you can use for your own benefit. Rather, instead of using people and serve money, as Christians, we should use money and serve people. One practical example that I can think of is this. If you're in the positions that are paying you quite well, and then people under you that don't get as much benefit as you are, just because that's how the world operates, perhaps you can serve the people under you well by using your own money, just because the company doesn't serve them well. Out of your own pocket. But if you're married, you speak to your spouse first. Discuss about it. That's how you could do it. Or you say, well, this is what the company gave me. This is what I earn. You don't do that. Because you see everyone as equal. Out of your own pocket. Because your goal is to serve people and use money, not the other way around. That's how Christians should work. So work as our worship to God means service to others. The higher you climb the career ladder, the lower you must go down to serve. The more that God has blessed you with, the more generous you should be. The highest God has lifted you up, the most humble you must become. Jesus has shown us how it is done. There's no other person that is higher than our God. He himself, in Matthew 28 says this, even as the Son of Man, he came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. He's God, he's the creator, he can do anything. To save you, he can come up with so many different ways rather than to die. He can. He's God. Yet he chose to come as a servant, not as nobleman, not as a king. He came as a servant to serve you, to show us the way. The higher God lifted you up, the lower you must go to serve one another. So in Jesus, humility is not just a way to greatness, but Jesus showed that humility is greatness itself. You don't humble yourself so that you get lifted up. Jesus said you humble yourself because that's great. When you humble yourself, that is greatness. That is when the world see the glory of God. If Jesus didn't come down from heaven and went up to the cross See, our work, what you do every day, Monday to Friday, even Saturday, your work will be a cruel master. Nothing more than that. Just a cruel master that will enslave you, that will demand more and more from you. At the end, you'll be driven to despair. It will destroy your life. It will destroy your children. It will destroy your marriage. In other words, if Jesus didn't come down and died and be destroyed on the cross, your work is a death sentence. There's always that struggle while we're on earth. Yes, that's true, but there's hope. If you're a Christian, you bring hope to your workplace. It doesn't have to be a death sentence. See, on the cross, instead of you being crushed by your work, on the cross, Jesus' cross was crushed and destroyed so that you don't have to. He took our death sentence, you see, so that when you go to work tomorrow, your work can be God-glorifying, your work can be joyful, your work can be a worship to God as a display of God's glory. Think about it. Your work, whatever it is, people will see God through how you do your work. And that is a privilege. That is a privilege. Let us pray.